if a CISO is put in a position where they can't confidently be deposed and demonstrate that they've taken cost-effective, reasonable, and prudent steps to manage the risk, or at the very least, we've made leadership well aware and they made a well-informed decision to accept that risk, we can't demonstrate due diligence and due care and put our organizations in the most defensible position.
This is a Security Weekly production. Security Weekly is a resource of Cyber Risk Alliance.
The Cybersecurity Collaborative is proud to present CISO Stories. Each week, CISO Stories takes a deep dive on security leadership with one of the contributors to my latest book, the best-selling CISO Compass: Navigating Cybersecurity Leadership Challenges with Insights from Pioneers, as well as other top CISOs and industry security leaders. The Cybersecurity Collaborative is a unique membership community enabling cybersecurity leaders to work together in a trusted environment. To learn more, visit securityweekly.com/CSC or visit cyberleadersunite.com. I'm your host, Todd Fitzgerald, and this week we welcome Troy Stairwalt, University of Akron faculty and former CISO, Akron Children's Hospital.
Thanks for having me on today. When I look at my career path like yours, it wasn't a direct trajectory into cybersecurity, but what attracted me is that the technology changes fast. I used to say that the regulations change slow. That's no longer a true statement. They seem to be accelerating, and the cyber threat landscape can literally change overnight. So being dedicated to being a lifelong learner, I find that it's some unique challenges and that it's ever evolving, and that keeps my interest. And there's always a new challenge to address tomorrow.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I think it's, when we look back year over year and all the changes in the industry, it's nothing stays static here. The laws are changing, the technologies are changing, and it's got to be difficult keeping up with all that to keep all these parts moving.
It's an ongoing challenge just to keep up with the regulations depending on the industry that you're in. Let alone the ever-evolving technologies. I would say that through the pandemic, the digital transformation, and you've had a couple guests that I listened to that talked about the remote workforce and how that expanded our attack surface area. I completely agree with that. And it was another situation where CISOs were in a position where we have to enable the business or the organization, whatever that looks like for the individual, and then figure out how we're going to secure it to reasonable and prudent levels to manage that risk. And when I look at it, not only isn't our technology regulations static, but the cyber threat landscape is evolving at an ever accelerated rate. And I think that poses some unique challenges. When I look at it, I've always been a hero of the underdogs. And I would say that in cybersecurity, that's currently where our profession finds ourselves.
That's a very good way to put it. So today we're going to talk about business ethics and the CISO, and I find this to be a fascinating topic. Probably doesn't get as much attention as looking at what controls we have in our environment or what the strategy is. So help walk us through that. Why is business ethics so important, and how should the CISO be operating in that environment?
Well, when this topic first came to mind and I started exploring it a little further, Todd, is that we all understand that there's a severe deficiency in cybersecurity talent and resources out there. And I had an opportunity where the University of Akron had reached out to my former employer and asked if they had somebody that had at least their CISSP, their CISA, and a master's degree. Our comptroller said we have one animal like that running around here. I don't know if they're interested in picking up some, additional work or some time, energy, and effort, because anybody who's been in teaching knows that we don't do it for the financial rewards. But I decided that I could be part of the solution, or I could be a Monday morning quarterback and whine, cry, and complain about it. So I started teaching, and where they wanted me to focus first was to help the students understand why cybersecurity was such an important focus. And the dean of the School of Accountancy wanted me to help them understand what Sarbanes-Oxley was and where it came from, and why that was important to understand before they got out into their professional realm. So I start the first couple classes with my students going through Sarbanes-Oxley was literally the name of two senators who drafted that legislation. And as we look back through history, regulations are a lagging indicator and a reaction to some risk that we're trying to mitigate or manage. Well, CISOs are all risk practitioners. And when we go back to it, I would say that the CISO from Lowe's was hitting it, where they were talking about sometimes we get lost on the CIA triad and we focus on the confidentiality. Well, Sarbanes-Oxley was all about the integrity of the financial reporting. And why that came about was because, left to their own devices, senior leadership put profits over integrity. And I would say that Sarbanes-Oxley came out as a result of a lack of business ethics between WorldCom, Enron, Tyco. And when I look at that at cybersecurity and put that into context, is that I would say that we're on down a similar path now when it comes to cybersecurity regulations and data privacy. And in the last couple of years, we've seen the data privacy regulations accelerate in new adoptions in at least 4 states that I'm aware of.
I think that's a very good point. And I think we've had things recently, if we look in the crypto world, for example, with FTX, a lot of discussion around, business ethics and a lot of comparison to the Enron days of what was really going on there. And then we have the questions around big tech companies with, Elon Musk taking on Twitter now. And what's that going to do to the messaging that comes out? So how does the CISO operate in these environments?
Well, you hit a couple of points that were very relevant and top of mind there. Is that for FTX, the individual that came in to review it said it was the most complete lack of corporate controls he'd ever seen. And I believe that was coming from an individual who had been involved in some of the Sarbanes-Oxley post-incident evaluations. So he had a point of reference there that's very relevant. When you look about the financial consequences there, WorldCom, Enron, a lot of employees from the research I did, they had their entire retirement and pensions in company stock. And when they went bankrupt, generations were impacted. For FTX, you're talking billions of dollars that are gone overnight, and they can't explain where that money's gone. So again, it's a lack of transparency and good controls over the integrity of the data that I believe leads to that. When you brought up Twitter, so what's going on with Elon Musk? We have a situation where the CISO was front and center not long ago, and he was testifying in front of the U.S. Senate and Congress and was listed as a whistleblower. Now, I've had some candid conversations with colleagues, and he's in a unique situation because just months before, Twitter had paid him $7 million. And the comment was, well, if you're a whistleblower, you're never going to be employable again. But I would say that individual was being true to their own personal code of conduct and ethics by coming forthright and being transparent on that. I was in a CISO exchange last week at a major law firm, and the discussion came up about Joe Sullivan from Uber. And that's another one where it puts the CISO front and center in just the last few months. And when you look at that, is that here's an individual who was an attorney. He was working for a well-known brand internationally and was put in a position where he had to make some business ethics and personal judgments on what was right and wrong to do at that particular time. Now, everybody has their perspective, and I try to refrain from being a Monday morning quarterback on those situations. But the discussion around the table was that he didn't make that decision in a vacuum, right? But when it comes down to it, they allocated $100,000 coming out of a bug bounty program. I would say that would run counter to my own personal code of conduct. I don't know how you ask cyber criminals to sign an NDA. I don't even know where to begin with that discussion. But when it comes down to it, if a CISO is put in a position where they can't confidently be deposed and demonstrate that they've taken cost-effective, reasonable, and prudent steps to manage the risk, or at the very least, we've made leadership well aware and they made a well-informed decision to accept that risk, we can't demonstrate due diligence and due care and put our organizations in the most defensible position. And I would say that as CISOs, that's really where we want to be. How do we, good, bad, or a worst case scenario, put our organization in a situation and position where we can articulate what the risks were and the decisions that were made and why?
The article this podcast is based upon can be viewed in the best-selling cybersecurity leadership book, CISO Compass, Navigating Cybersecurity Leadership Challenges with Insights from Pioneers. I mean, it's a really good point that we don't work in a vacuum, that there's a corporate organization that is around us. And we, as CISOs are it's kind of like the orchestra leader of a band, right? That we're up front but everybody has an instrument that they need to know how to play. But the orchestra leader isn't the one who is trained in how to execute that instrument, but he's giving that direction. And but who owns that responsibility in the end for that corporate governance? Who would that be?
Well, and we've had that discussion a lot of times, and I took a class with you years ago that was harmonizing standards, and came back and had a discussion that neither IT nor information security owns the risk. And when you come down to the root of it, who owns the loss when a risk occurs? Well, the business or the organization ultimately owns that. And as risk practitioners, our responsibility is to help leadership make a well-informed decision and understand what that risk looks like. Coming from several insurance companies, it was a little bit easier conversation because they have actuarial built into their genes. And you can talk about probability and impact. And that if you make certain investments and put the right people, processes, and technology in place, you can reduce either the probability or the impact. Now you have to come back to the organization and help them determine what is your risk tolerance, what is your risk appetite. And if it exceeds that, what are we willing to do to reduce it? And some of the ways that I've explained it is that just because you take out an insurance policy doesn't mean you're not going to have an accident. But you need to decide, do you want collision? Do you want comprehensive? What do you want your deductible to be? What do you want bodily injury to be? Do you want uninsured motorist? Do you want underinsured motorist? And if I can get the organization to tell me what those specifics are, coming back in some relatable terms, I can help them define what their risk tolerance, their risk appetite is, and then in turn, as a CISO and a leader, right-size the security program and spend to manage the risk to those levels. And I think that that's where we want to position ourselves.
So I think that sounds good that we need to do those things as CISOs. So as we're looking at business ethics with this, what do we do when an organization is saying, well, that's not really that big of an impact, or that's not really going to cost us that much. But as a CISO, with your experience level, that this is either underfunded or the impact's going to be much greater than they're playing it to be. And you're being asked to, put that in the risk register as a low risk when you think it's really a high risk. How do you navigate that from an ethical perspective?
Well, first, I'll take it from a tactical perspective, is that I had an opportunity to work with several incredible mentors throughout my career. And I was working with Jack Prudent when he was drafting FAIR. And so quantifying risk helps within ranges, right? The way that he instructed me was that it's better to be accurate than precise. So you come back and help to quantify that risk and say, the old adage is that as risk practitioners, we never want to spend more on a loss than it would cost us. Now, when we're dealing with different leadership, everybody has their own priorities, their own perspective. And what it comes down to is that, as you so eloquently put it, is that that's not really going to cost us this much. And I'm going from memory here, so we'll have to fact check afterwards. But I remember there was a famous statement from one of the IT leaders from Sony going back into the 90s. And they came out and said that we've made a business decision that we absolutely refuse to spend $10 million to mitigate a potential $1 million loss. Does that sound familiar to you?
Yeah, it does.
Okay. So I try to be a student of history because, as we know, those who fail to study history are doomed to repeat it. And when I look forward to what happened in the Sony breach, I had a chance to work with and for a while at the FBI special agent who responded to that breach. And when he showed up and they asked what systems are compromised, well, all of them are, right? And the last research that I did showed that after the Sony breach and the dust settled, the total loss was $1.25 billion. So I think that somebody underestimated the total impact to the organization there. And that's where leaders have to not only understand their organization's risk tolerance, risk appetite, and what their business ethics are as far as what are the resources that they're willing to allocate and dedicate as far as people, processes, and appropriate technical controls to mitigate the risk. And then they have to also understand their own. So at what point does the organization's personal code of conduct and ethics conflict with your own personal? And I don't know, I've heard different people talking about it, that as a CISO, we all need to have a rainy day fund or an emergency fund because things change. I know in your career, you've been outsourced several times. CISOs get displaced. And when you're faced with an ethical or moral dilemma where your own personal beliefs conflict with that of the organization, if you don't have that fund, because at some point the organization is going to turn around, and I think Uber is a point in case here, and say bad things happened, F you, or you have to look at it and say, these are my own personal moral and ethical beliefs. And if you don't have those funds to fall back on, you're left with little choice.
So you're saying a personal fund from the CISO for when that job ends or whatever, it's time to say, I really need to depart from this organization.
Correct. Either it's their decision or yours that you're going to separate that employment in that relationship. You need to have that to fall back on. And I've heard it phrased several ways, but yeah, a person with savings has options.
So what are those principles that, where is that line that ethics is always about a line? What are those principles that you think are that point where the CISO should be saying, you know what, I need to walk away from this organization?
Well, I would say that as risk tolerance and appetite is unique to the organization, the nature of the business, coming from financial services and insurance, that's one thing when I look at it and can say, if in a worst case scenario, there's going to be financial implications. I would say that it's the same with the CISO, is that every CISO has to look at it, and all of the certifications that carry any credibility in our industry have a code of conduct. Well, I believe that that's because they don't want individuals coming out and getting the certifications and doing unethical things that would degrade the value of those certifications, Todd.
So what are some of those things or those principles that a CISO, needs to adhere to is to figure out where their own personal line is, not to cross?
Well, I would say that it's unique to the individual, but you have to know yourself well enough. As a general rule, when I'm teaching to the class, I find it difficult to stand up there and talk the talk if I'm not willing to walk it. And so I do some self-reflection. And if you find yourself in a situation where you come into an organization and you're reviewing the results of some penetration test, and maybe there's more urgent or critical matters than leadership would like. And the way I described it is that, ideally you should go to the dentist every 6 months. And if you don't go for 7 years, you're going to, I would envision a situation where you might have some smoke rolling out of your mouth. And it's going to be more painful and expensive than insurance might cover. And you're going to be fortunate if you don't need a root canal. If leadership asks you to refrain from sharing some of those specifics, or if you're coming through a major regulatory audit and you are asked to suppress information that you're supposed to give to, say, the board of directors audit committee, then you have to do some really hard self-reflection and determine if that's something that you're willing to do. Because I believe that if we go against our own moral code of conduct and ethics, that we're going to be in for a lot of stressful days and sleepless nights until the inevitable happens. And if we haven't done the right things for the right reasons, we're setting ourselves up for a situation similar to where Joe Sullivan from Uber found himself. And I would say those are some of the things that if you're not empowered to help leadership make a well-informed decision by sharing the facts as you see them, then that's a line that I'm not willing to cross, Todd.
What if your leadership says, yeah, but you're the paid paranoid person that is always bringing up all this stuff about all these big threats and fear, uncertainty, and doubt, and I don't want you to go to my board and tell them that stuff.
And I get that, and I prefer not to lead with the fear, uncertainty, and doubt. I think that that's been overused in our profession. And to sit back in a dispassionate way and share the facts or the results of a penetration test or of a regulatory audit and help them understand what that means from your perspective, understand what their perspective is as well, brings you to a place where you can make a well-informed decision and a compromise on what are reasonable and prudent resources that should be allocated to mitigate the risk. And with what sense of urgency. If you can come back to terms with leadership and says, okay, what I'd like to do is come in and say, here's where we are, and here's what we're going to do about it. That's a much more productive conversation.
I think that's very well said. So this has been great, Troy. I always enjoy talking with you. And what sort of final advice would you like to give to our listeners, whether they're emerging CISOs, current CISOs, experienced CISOs, as they go down this journey to make sure that they're practicing good ethics and their organizations are being ethical around security?
Well, first and foremost, learn from your peers. That's where the CISO Compass came invaluable. When I had the opportunity and listening to your podcast, I found invaluable. Also, know where you sit in the organization. At the CISO exchange we had last week, is that several CISOs, when we asked how many were directors and officers of their organization, over half were listed as an associate vice president or director, and they weren't even covered by their organization's D&O coverage, which leaves you particularly vulnerable in a worst case scenario. Understand your organization's risk tolerance and appetite and what their business ethics are regarding mitigating the cyber risk. Do some self-reflection, understand your own, right? Build up your rainy day, your emergency, or your FU fund, because when that day comes, that will be invaluable. Find your calm, your peace, and your happy. Mine currently through the pandemic was yoga and meditation. My dad joke is that every CISO should get all stretched out instead of been out of shape, but that's just the way I look at that.
Like that.
And when I come down to it is keep and maintain your integrity and your sense of humor. As CISOs, you are going to need both.
Well, I think that's very well said, Troy. And thanks a lot for taking time for our listeners today.
Thanks for having me on today, Todd. Just want to take a moment to let you know that the first couple of classes that I took with you, you came in as the big cheese from the first class that I had. The second course that I took with you, you instructed the entire class dressed as Darth Vader. Now, those that don't know you may not realize that you are naturally an introvert, and it takes a lot of time, energy, and effort for you to go out there. But by doing so, you made the classes educational, engaging, and entertaining. And so I guess that your approach was enter education or edutainment, if you would. And I try to bring some of that to my classes as I teach as well. And I would say that you were an inspiration for that approach. So thank you. Appreciate it very much.
Well, thanks for saying that. I think if you can't have fun in life, there's no point in living. So thank you.
Absolutely. I appreciate it, Todd.
Thanks. Visit more CISO Stories podcasts on securityweekly.com, where you will find an index to prior episodes. The Cybersecurity Collaborative is a unique membership community enabling cybersecurity leaders to work together in a trusted environment. To learn more, visit securityweekly.com/CSC or visit cyberleadersunite.com.